Today is the feast of the Epiphany of Jesus. Not a very important celebration in most places in the United States, so unimportant that they even moved it years ago from January 6th, unless that falls on a Sunday, to the nearest Sunday with it. But in Europe, and especially in Italy where I lived for 4 years, Epiphany is a much more important celebration than even Christmas. Christmas, you would simply have gifts like you would have probably on St. Nicholas Day here. Christmas would be sort of fade into the background when January 6th arrived. That's the day you got the big gifts. Nobody did anything on January 6th. It was a national holiday. That's what's kind of funny, because no one in this country would ever think of shifting Christmas off of December 25th. And yet, obviously, we've done that with the Feast of the Epiphany, at least in this country. Originally, Epiphany was celebrated as 3 separate events. It was to commemorate the Magi, it was to commemorate Jesus' baptism, it was also to commemorate his changing of water into wine at Cana in Galilee, because the early Christian community looked at each of those as an epiphany, a coming out, a way of shining a spotlight on Jesus to say he might be more important than just ordinary men and women are in his day and age. But we'll take the Feast of the Magi today, and the first reading is from 3rd Isaiah, from chapter 60. Rise up in splendor, Jerusalem, your light has come. The glory of Yahweh shines upon you. See, darkness covers the earth, and thick clouds cover the peoples. But upon you Yahweh shines, and over you appears his glory. Nations shall walk by your light, and kings by your shining radiance. Raise your eyes and look about. They all gather and come to you. Your sons come from afar, and your daughters in the arms of their nurses. Then you shall be radiant at what you see. Your heart shall throb and overflow. For the riches of the sea shall be emptied out before you. The wealth of nations shall be brought to you. Caravans of camels shall fill you. Dromedaries from Midian and Ephah, all from Sheba shall come, bearing gold and frankincense, and proclaiming the praises of Yahweh. This is the word of the Lord. The second reading is from a disciple of Paul, and is from his letter to the Ephesians. Brothers and sisters, you've heard of the stewardship of God's grace that was given to me for your benefit, namely, that the mystery was made known to me by revelation. It was not made known to people in other generations, as it has now been revealed to his holy apostles and prophets by the Spirit, that the Gentiles are co-heirs, members of the same body, and co-partners in the promise in Christ Jesus through the gospel. Word of the Lord. And the gospel pericope today is that one we all know from Matthew 2, the story of the Magi. When Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of King Herod, behold, Magi from the east arrived in Jerusalem, saying, Where is the newborn King of the Jews? We saw his star in its rising, and have come to do him homage. When King Herod heard this, he was greatly troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They said to him, In Bethlehem of Judea, for thus it has been written through the prophet. And you, Bethlehem, land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, since from you shall come a ruler who is to shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod called the Magi secretly, and ascertained from them the time of the star's appearance. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, Go and search diligently for the child. When you found him, bring me word, that I too may go and do him homage. After their audience with the king, they set out, and behold, the star that they had seen at its rising preceded them, until it came and stopped over the place where the child was. They were overjoyed at seeing the star, and on entering the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother. They prostrated themselves and did him homage. Then they opened their treasures, and offered him gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed for their country by another way. the gospel of the Lord. As I mentioned, this particular feast was very early celebrated in the church, much earlier than Christmas ever was celebrated. And it was important that Jesus have a coming out during his ministry or during his lifetime, that people, at least those who would be his followers, would recognize his significance. But this all revolves around his being, especially in Matthew's gospel, the Messiah. I hate to tell you, if you're not old enough to realize it, but things never work out in the future exactly the way we plan them to work out. And it certainly didn't work out that way for Jesus' fellow Jews. Years ago, in the late 70s, the late Raymond Brown gave some conferences to the priests of the Belleville Diocese. And one of the things that he said that really kind of shook up some of the brothers was that Jesus was not the Messiah that Jews had been expecting the Messiah to be. He said rather nicely, that Messiah, the one they're expecting or had expected, has never come. The concept of Messiah in Scripture is a constant flux, a constant changing. When people thought of the Messiah in the 9th century BCE in Israel, they didn't think of the same characteristics that people in the 6th century BCE Israel would think of. You always conceived of the Messiah as being the person who would help you in whatever straits or dire problems you had in the day and age in which the Messiah was looked upon. And at the time of Jesus especially, Jews were under Roman occupation, and the vast majority of Jews hated the Romans. And if they ever thought of a Messiah and a Messiah coming, one of the main things that Messiah should have done was to get rid of the Romans. That's why it's very significant in the Gospels, in the event of Palm Sunday, that Jesus comes into Jerusalem not riding a horse. That's the weapon of war, something that a leader who would get rid of the Romans would logically ride. And Jesus comes in riding a donkey. The evangelists are telling their readers, Jesus is the Messiah, but he's a different type of Messiah. I always stress there's good news and there's bad news on Palm Sunday. The good news is the Messiah is here. The bad news is he's riding a donkey. That's why it's important that Luke bring up this whole concept of Gentiles. Because one of the things that even Jesus' followers had not anticipated was Gentiles becoming Christians. They wouldn't object to Gentiles. Certainly, 3rd Isaiah talks about Gentiles becoming Jews, or at least worshiping Yahweh like Jews would worship Yahweh, and even giving treasures to the people of Jerusalem. But the difficulty was, at the time of Matthew, writing for a Jewish Christian community, that the Gentiles coming in to Christianity came in as Gentiles. If they had converted to Judaism first, there would have been no problem. But here they come in as Gentiles. And one of the difficulties that the early Christians would have had would have been, with the Magi especially, these Gentiles are astrologers. I don't know how we ever got exactly to looking at the Magi as kings. Most probably, though, it came from the Greek word magoi that's in the original text in Matthew 2 in reference to these guys. When it was transliterated into Latin, instead of putting the word for astrologer into Latin, they simply transliterated the word magoi and made it magi. And once it said magi in Latin, magus is the name for an important high muckety-muck. Magi would be more than one of them. Most people looked at it and said, I bet they were kings or princes or somebody. That's how we got involved in this. But it's important to remember they were astrologers. And the earliest representations that we have of the Magi in the famous churches in Ravenna, they are wearing astrologer clothing. They were not looked upon as kings. In Judaism, you were obligated, if you came face to face with an astrologer, to kill him. Automatically, astrologers could not live. And Matthew's saying not only these Gentiles, but these Gentile astrologers discover Jesus as Messiah and King, even when Jews, represented by Herod, have no desire to even go and find where he's born. And so these magi then become very significant in our history, very significant also in Matthew's theology of constantly being open over and over again to God doing things differently than we anticipate God doing them. It's also very important when we look at this from several directions that these magi bring three separate gifts. By the way, that's where we come up with the idea there were three of them. It never tells us how many magi were there, and it could have easily been 5 or 6 of them who simply chipped in and got 3 gifts. Or there could have been just 2 of them, and one guy brought 2 gifts. Somebody sent me a rather interesting cartoon the other day in which one of the magi is walking away from the home of Jesus in Bethlehem, and it says rather nicely, there really were 4 of them, but the 4th one brought fruitcake and no one let him in. So obviously we don't have to have 3. But those gifts become rather significant when you try to look at what the evangelists are trying to say. And even though, like that author of Ephesians stresses, that we found this mystery that the Gentiles are now on an equal basis with Jews. Even then, when you look at Jesus and the gifts that they bring, some of them make some sense, like the incense, the gold. That's in 3rd Isaiah. We saw that when people who were non-Jews would come to Jerusalem bearing gifts. But Matthew adds one gift, myrrh. And the late Dr. Arkin from St. Louis U, whenever he would treat this passage, would always say, what would you think if on your birthday somebody handed you a gift-wrapped bottle of embalming fluid? Because myrrh was often used for that purpose, to anoint dead bodies so they wouldn't smell too bad while they were decaying. And in a way, Matthew's saying, no matter what your image of Jesus as Messiah, no matter if you're a Jewish Christian or a Gentile Christian, you have to deal with the fact that being another Christ, being a disciple of Jesus, entails dying. You can't simply look at Jesus of Nazareth without looking and understanding his death. That's something to which all of us are called to imitate. So on this feast of the Epiphany, such a glorious feast in many places of the world, we're constantly called to always remind us that the death of Jesus is there. I remember years ago, not this current movie on the Titanic that most of us have seen, but one back from the 50s, that one in which the couples on board the Titanic, the guy proposes to the woman and she accepts his proposal. And for a few minutes you forget this is April 1912, the name of the ship's the Titanic, until the guy is so happy that she's accepted his proposal, he takes off his cap and throws it overboard. And for some reason, the camera follows the cap, and the cap lands in the ocean right next to a chunk of ice. And everybody watching the movie says, I don't think this marriage is going to ever take place. In a parallel way, Matthew, after all these glorious things about Jesus, after the gifts that the Magi bring, reminds us this is Jesus of Nazareth, and reminds us very simply with the little bottle of myrrh that one of the Magi brought. If it's Jesus, our dying has to come before the rising. If we wish to look at Jesus as Messiah, he's a dying and rising Messiah, not the glorious Messiah that a lot of people, and even we, very often expect. Thank you.